Last fall, Dr. Dave Russell of Miami University, right here, was out birding in a local state park, as you tend to do on your Friday nights after a long week at university, when he came across a young male bay-breasted warbler. Now, the bay-breasted warbler is a bird that we know as a neotropical migrant. And this is a bird species that winters in South and Central America, migrates all the way up to the boreal forests of Canada and the northern United States just to breed, and then makes the same trip back down to South and Central America to winter, only to do the same thing for the next year. And they're also a really special bird in that they rely very heavily on a species of caterpillar known as the spruce budworm. That is their predominant and main food source. So it wasn't a surprise, really, that he came across this bird hopping along the way in front of him, because currently there's a huge, massive number of these bugs out in Maine. And so we're right in the middle of that path in between Maine and South and Central America. That was no surprise to him. The surprise came from when this bird that was hopping along the road in front of him suddenly collapsed and died of fatigue. It was a surprise that this bird that was in really the first third of its migration, it wasn't very far along at all, that had just left probably the most ample food source it will ever know, had not only metabolized all of its fat upon inspection, but also all of its muscle. It was quite purely and simply skin and bone, nothing more. And what's both the most and also least surprising, scarily enough, about this is that this bird isn't a one-off. No, this bay-breasted warbler is part of a much larger body throughout the bird community. It's one of 3 billion. 3 billion birds that we've lost in North America alone in the past 50 years, about 30%. This slide shows 30. You would have to look at it 100 million times to truly understand the scope of that loss. And unfortunately, I only have 5 to 7 minutes. And so the question becomes, what is the story of this bird? What is the story of this bird and the scope of all these birds, all these losses? But before we get to that story, there's another story that we have to touch upon. And that's the story of this ugly little fella. Its food source, the spruce budworm. So like I said, it's a little bit ugly, but at the same time, just as the bay-breasted warbler relies on it for its food source, the spruce budworm is very intimately tied with its food source, spruce trees, if you couldn't gather that. Now, like I said, it's a little bit ugly, but it's a little bit important, and if you're having trouble understanding how important plants are to these bugs in their caterpillar stage, let's take a step back to one of its really close cousins, the monarch butterfly. Now, if you're even mildly acquainted with local pollinators and gardening for bugs and plants and all that, you probably know that in order to get those crazy colored caterpillars in your backyard, you have to plant a lot of milkweed. And moths are the same way, in that they rely very heavily on plants to sustain caterpillar life till they can turn into those big, beautiful flying insects that we see in adulthood. But unlike the butterflies, unlike our monarch butterfly, for every one species of butterfly, there are 8 species of moths. It is a much more diverse and much more robust community. And there's a lot of different characterizations and relationships that these moths have with plants. Take, for example, our root borer moths, the Papillopemas, who are so intimately tied with the host plant that they feed on as caterpillars that this species, rattlesnake master borer moth, is actually going extinct because its host plant is currently almost unheard of where I'm from, back in Naperville, Illinois. Or we can go to another really specific example, what I like to call the world's most Instagrammable moth, the rosy maple moth. Now, those sherbet colors may look like I made them in Photoshop, but I promise this is completely true to life. And when you look at its relationship with its host plant, the maple tree, you can see how intimate of a connection that is between the host plant and the species itself. And now these are 2 examples of specialists, but there are also a lot more generalistic species. For example, the Cecropia moth, who can feed off of very many plant species. And in the same vein, there are also a lot of species of plants, like the red osier dogwood, that can sustain really robust caterpillar communities just in their own. Like I said, this is red osier dogwood. This is actually the most common dogwood, a shrubbing, flowering plant. It's got woody branches. That is very common across the United States. It's actually the most common dogwood that we have within the United States. And you might find yourself pretty lucky to have one in your backyard here, but you'd also be pretty lucky to know that this dogwood alone could sustain over 90 species of caterpillars, which doesn't seem like a lot until you realize that that number is magnified by how many individual caterpillars it can hold. Over 100,000 on one bush at one time. Imagine living with 100,000 people. Awful, terrible. But imagine the change in the story of our bay-breasted warbler that could have been written if it came across just one of these bushes, 100,000 caterpillars. And I'd be remiss if I were to go back to the story of the bay-breasted warbler because, truthfully, there's one more story that's still being written that plays a hugely important part. And that's the story of our red osier dogwood, of our plant community. This is an aerial shot of my very own hometown. This is my backyard, full disclosure. This is Naperville, Illinois. And the first thing you'll probably notice is that it's very green. There's a lot of green on that image. There's a lot of trees, but more importantly, there's a lot of another plant, and that's grass. And the things accenting that grass are very often plants like tulips and hostas and other plants that are beautiful and have a place in landscaping, but at the same time, don't necessarily support as robust of a moth community as plants like our red osier dogwood or plants like cardinal flower or other native plants. To take a more specific example, we can go to a cousin of the red osier dogwood, the Kosa dogwood, a non-native variety related to the red osier dogwood that, just like the red osier, is a beautiful flowering plant. But while the red osier dogwood can supply 92 different species of caterpillars, the Kosa, 0. Absolutely none. There is not a single caterpillar native to the United States that has developed and evolved to rely on that plant. And so it's by understanding that story that's been written, the story that's been written of how humans are relating to plants and then extending it to how plants relate to moths and then how moths relate to birds and how birds relate to our one focal bird, that we can begin to understand the story that was told of our bay-breasted warbler. And more importantly, the story that I like to call the story of us, the story of everything, the story of the ecology of where we live and the story of how everything impacts each other. Because truth be told, this story is being written every day, all the time, and all those stories are being written at the same time. And it's by understanding that story, the story of us, that we can begin to then also rewrite it. Rewrite it in a way that maybe replaces a Kosa dogwood with a red osier dogwood, or a tulip with a cardinal flower, or any sort of plant that supports these populations, so that we can go from having plant communities and lawns that look something like this standard suburban home, to ones that look a little bit more like miniature ecosystems akin to this, so that we can start supporting moth populations that, rather than looking largely like this, start to turn into something more like this, so that the lasting impression we get when we spend our Friday nights bird watching in Houston Woods State Park goes from being an impression of a bird that looks like this to one that looks like this. Thank you.